Beelzebub's Tales to His Grandson, Chapter 29. The Fruits of Former Civilizations and the Blossoms of the Contemporary. According to the associative flow of my tales concerning the three-brained beings breeding on the planet Earth who have taken your fancy, I must now, my boy, without fail, explain to you a little more about those two powerful communities there named Greeks and Romans, who made a clean sweep from the surface of that ill-fated planet of even the memory of the results obtained from the most saintly labors of the essence-loving Asiatic. I must tell you first of all that at that period, when on the surface of your planet, on the continent of Asia, there was actualized from above within the presence of a three-brained being, the already definitized sacred conception of our now omnicosmic, very saintly Asiatic. And later also, during the periods of his very saintly activities, and the subsequent gradual destruction by your favorites of all the results obtained from them. There also existed, on the neighboring continent, then already called Europe, great numbers of those strange three-brained beings who have taken your fancy, and who had already long before grouped themselves into various independent communities. Among the number of those independent communities, there were, during those periods owing to those cosmic laws which I have once mentioned to you, those two large, and, as they say there, most powerful communities, that is to say, well organized and possessing more means for the processes of reciprocal destruction, the Greeks and Romans. And about these, from the point of view of your contemporary favorites, very ancient communities, I must furthermore not fail to explain to you, and possibly in detail, because not only did they then, as I've already said, make a clean sweep from the face of that unfortunate planet of the last results beneficial for all the three-brained beings of all subsequent epochs, and even of all traces of the memory of the very saintly labors of the essence-loving Asiatic, but they were also the cause that real nonsense already proceeds in the reasons of the contemporary favorites of yours, and that there is completely atrophied in them that fundamental being impulse which is the main lever of objective morality, and which is called organic shame. A closer acquaintance with these big groupings of your favorites, and with various forms of bliss prepared by them, and which have passed to the beings of later epochs, will give you a good idea and enable you to understand exactly how separate independent communities are formed there, and also how a given community, having become powerful quite independently of the beings themselves, takes advantage of the fact and sets about destroying everything already attained by the other less powerful communities, and forces upon them their own new inventions, in most cases sincerely imagining that they truly are just what the others need. I must warn you, my boy, that my story of the history of their arising and of everything later connected with those ancient communities called Greeks and Romans is not based on the results of my personal investigations. No, I shall only give you the information about them which I got from one of those beings of our tribe who wished to remain to exist forever on that planet of yours. The circumstances were these. In descending to the planet Earth for the sixth and last time, I proposed to attain at any cost the final elucidation for myself of all the genuine causes why the psyche of those three-brained beings, which should be like the psyche of the rest of the three-brained beings of our great universe, had on that planet become so exceptionally strange. and having during my investigations repeatedly constated that a fundamental cause of the various abnormalities of the general psyche of the contemporary beings was what is called civilization, sown by those two large groups of beings called Greeks and Romans, I was obliged to inquire into certain details about them also. But as I was fully occupied at that time with my researches concerning the activities of the very saintly Asiatic, I commissioned the elucidation of the history of the arising of these two independent groupings of your favorites in respect of what is called their subjective being to that same being of our tribe who, as I've already told you, still carries on an undertaker's business in a large city on the continent of Europe down to the present time. From the investigations of this countryman of ours, it seems that long ago before the period to which my tale about the majestic city of Babylon referred, namely, at the time when the process of the existence of those strange beings was proceeding mainly on the continent of Asia alone, and when their chief center of culture was Tikliamish, there were on that said continent of Europe, which is now the chief place of existence of your favorites, as yet no definitely organized communities. There then chiefly existed on that continent two-brained and one-brained beings called wild quadrupeds and reptiles. But of your favorites, the biped beings, there were then on that continent only a number of small groups, almost as wild as the quadrupeds themselves. The occupation of these small groups of biped beings was merely the destruction of the quadruped and reptile beings, and occasionally also of each other. And the numbers of your favorites on that continent Europe only increased when emigrants from Maral Plessis, wandering from one place to another, finally arrived and settled there. Towards the close of that period, there migrated from Tikliamish to that continent Europe a number of beings of the first Asiatic group who followed two quite distinct occupations. Namely, some of them were engaged in various marine occupations, and others in what are called their cattle raising and sheep farming. The cattle raising families populated chiefly the southern shores of the continent because those parts were at that time very convenient for the maintenance and grazing of such quadruped beings. And that group of terrestrial beings was then called Latinaki, a word that signifies shepherds. At first, these shepherds existed with their families and flocks scattered in different places, but later on their numbers gradually increased, partly from the immigration of beings from the continent Asia having the same occupation as themselves, and partly because they were becoming more and more prolific, owing to the fact that the nature of the planet Earth was beginning to adapt herself to the deteriorating quality of the vibrations she demanded, that had to be formed from their radiations, by substituting those vibrations which are now obtained only from the process of their sacred rascuano, or as they say, from their death. And thus, when, thanks to all this, their numbers had considerably increased and external conditions demanded frequent relations between separate families, they formed their first common place, and this common place they called Rimpk. It was from that group of Asiatic shepherds that the later famous Romans originated, their name having been taken from the name of their first common place, Rimpk. Those Asiatic beings who were engaged in marine occupations, namely in fishing and in gathering sponges, coral, and seaweed, emigrated with their families for the convenience of their profession, and settled either on the western shores of their own continent, Ashark, on the southeastern shores of the continent Europe, or on the islands of the straits which still divide the continents Asia and Europe. The beings of those newly formed groups of three-brained terrestrial beings were then called Hellenaki, a word that meant fishermen. The number of beings of that group also gradually increased owing to the same causes already mentioned respecting the group of shepherds. The name of the beings of this second group changed many times, and finally they came to be called Greeks. And so, my dear boy, the beings of these two groups were one of the chief causes that the reasons of the contemporary favorites of yours have become mechanical, and that the data for engendering the impulse of being shame have become completely atrophied in them. The Greeks were the cause why the reasons of the three-brained beings there began gradually to degenerate and ultimately became so degenerate that among contemporary beings it is already, as our dear Mullah Nasruddin says, a real mill for nonsense. And the Romans were the cause why, as a result of successive changes, those factors are never crystallized in the presences of the contemporary three-brained beings there, which in other three-brained beings engender the impulse called instinctive shame. That is to say, the being impulse that maintains what are called morals and objective morality. Thus it was that those two communities arose there, which afterwards, as it often happens there, became very solid and powerful for a definite period. And the history of their further maleficent prepared inheritance for the beings of subsequent generations is as follows. According to the investigations of our mentioned countrymen, it seems that the earliest ancestors of the beings of the community which was later called Greece were often obliged, on account of their frequent storms at sea which hindered them in their marine occupations, to seek refuge during the rains and winds in sheltered places, where, out of boredom, they played various games which they invented for their distraction. As it later became clear, these ancient fishermen amused themselves at first with such games as children now play there. But children, it must be remarked, who have not yet started contemporary schooling. Because the children there who do go to school have so much homework to do, consisting chiefly of learning by rote the poetry which various candidate Hasnamusses have composed there, that the poor children never have time to play any games. Briefly, these poor, bored fishermen played at first the ordinary children's games already established there long before, but afterwards, when one of them invented a new game called pouring from the empty into the void, they were also pleased with it that thereafter they amused themselves with that alone. This game consisted in formulating some question, always about some fiddle-faddle or other, that is to say, a question about some deliberate piece of absurdity, and the one to whom the question was addressed had to give as plausible an answer as possible. Well, it was just this same game that became the cause of all that happened later. It turned out that among those ancient bored fishermen there were several so bright and ingenious that they became expert in inventing, according to the principle of that peculiar game, very long explanations. And when one of them discovered how to make what was afterwards called parchment from the skin of the fish called shark, then some of these skillful fellows, just to swagger before their companions, even began inscribing these long explanations of theirs on these fish skins, employing those conventional signs which had been invented earlier for another game called Mousetrap. Still a little later, when these bored fishermen had already given place to their descendants, both these inscribed fish skins and the craze for the said peculiar game passed on to the latter by inheritance, and these various new inventions, both their own and their ancestors, they called first by the very high-sounding name science. And from then on, as the craze for cooking up these sciences passed from generation to generation, the beings of that group, whose ancestors had been simple Asiatic fishermen, became specialists in inventing all kinds of sciences as these. These sciences, moreover, also passed from generation to generation, and a number of them have reached the contemporary beings of that planet almost unchanged. And hence it is that almost a half of what are called the ego-plasticuri, arising in the reason of the contemporary beings of that ill-fated planet, from which what is called a being world outlook is in general formed in beings, are crystallized just from the truths invented there by those bored fishermen and their subsequent generations. Concerning the ancient shepherds, who later formed the great powerful community called Rome, their ancestors were often forced, on account of bad weather, to put their flocks into sheltered places, and to pass the time together somehow or other. Being together, they had various talks, but when everything had been talked out and they felt bored, then one of them suggested that, as a relief, they should take up the pastime which they called, for the first time, cinque contra uno, 5 against 1, an occupation which has been preserved down to the present time under the same name among their descendants who continue to arise and exist there. So long as only the beings of the male sex then engaged in that occupation, everything went quietly and peacefully. But when a little later their passive halves, that is to say their women, also joined in, who, immediately appreciating it, soon became addicted to it, they then gradually attained in these occupations such finesses that even if our all-universal arch-cunning Lucifer should rack his honorable brains, he could not even invent a tithe of the turns these erstwhile shepherds then invented and prepared for the beings of the succeeding generations of that ill-fated planet. And so, my boy, when both these independent groupings of terrestrial three-brained beings multiplied and began acquiring every variety of those effective means, namely the means of reciprocal destruction, whose acquisition is the usual aim of all communities there during all periods of their existence, they then began carrying out these processes with other independent communities there, for the most part, of course, with the less powerful communities, and occasionally among themselves. Here it is extremely interesting to notice that when periods of peace occurred between these two communities there, communities of almost equal strength in respect of the possession of efficient means for the processes of reciprocal destruction, the beings of both groups, whose places of existence were adjacent, often came in contact and had friendly relations with each other, with the result that little by little they picked up from each other those specialties which had first been invented by their ancestors and which had become proper to them. In other words, the result of the frequent contact of the beings of those two communities was that the Greek beings, borrowing from the Roman beings all the finesses of sexual turns, began arranging their what are called Athenian nights, while the Roman beings, having learned from the Greek beings how to cook up sciences, composed their later very famous what is called Roman law. A great deal of time had passed since then. The inventors of both those kinds of being manifestation have already long been destroyed, and their descendants who chance to become powerful have been destroyed also. And now, the contemporary three-brained beings of that planet spend, even with emotion, more than half of their existence and being energy, acquired somehow or other in absorbing and actualizing unconsciously and sometimes even consciously those two ideals, the initiators of whose arising were the said bored Asiatic fishermen and shepherds. Well then, my boy, later on, it seems, when both these groupings of your favorites acquired many of the said efficient means for the successful destruction of the existence of beings like themselves, and when they had become quite expert in persuading, or by potency of their means compelling beings of other countries to exchange their inner convictions for those ideals invented by their ancestors, then, as I have said, they first conquered the neighboring communities situated on the continent Europe, and afterwards, for the same purpose, with the help of the hordes they collected during that period, turned towards the continent Asia. And there already on the continent Asia they began spreading that maleficent influence of theirs, first among beings populating the western shores of that continent, in whom, as I have already said, being impulses for a more or less normal being existence had been implanted during centuries, and afterwards they gradually began advancing into the interior. This advance of theirs into the interior of the continent Asia proceeded very successfully, and their ranks were constantly being increased, chiefly because the learned beings who had been in Babylon then continued everywhere on the continent Asia to infect the reasons of beings with their Hasnamussian political ideas. And they were also helped very much by the fact that there were still preserved in the instincts of the Asiatic beings the results of the influences of the initiates and priests, disciples of the very saintly Ashiyata, who in their preachings had inculcated, among other things, one of the chief commandments of Ashiyata, which declared, "Do not kill another, even when your own life is in danger." Profiting by all this, these former fishermen and shepherds were very easily able to advance, destroying on the way all those who declined to worship the gods they themselves had finally acquired, that is to say, their fantastic science and their phenomenal depravity. At first these sowers of evil, for all the three-brained beings there of all the succeeding generations arising on the continent Europe, and especially the Greeks, moving into the interior of the continent Asia, acted, if slowly, nevertheless effectively. But when, some time later, there appeared and stood at the head of what is called an army, that completely formed arch-vainglorious Greek, the future Hasnamus, Alexander of Macedonia, then from that time on there began to proceed that clean sweep of the last remnants of the results of the very saintly intentional labors of our now common cosmic most very saintly Ashiyata. And again there was resumed, as it is said, the old story. Although every time the place of the center of culture of your favorites, those strange three-brained beings, has been changed, and what is called a new civilization has arisen, and each new civilization has brought for the beings of succeeding epochs something both new and maleficent. Nevertheless, not one of these numerous civilizations has ever prepared so much evil for the beings of later epochs, including, of course, the contemporary epoch, as that famous Greco-Roman civilization. without mentioning the large number of other minor psychic features unbecoming to be possessed by three-brained beings and now existing in the presences of your favorites, that civilization is mainly to blame for the complete disappearance from the presences of the three-brained beings of succeeding generations, and especially of the contemporary beings, of the possibility for crystallizing the data for sane logical mentation, and for engendering the impulse of being self-shame. Namely, the ancient Greek fantastic sciences caused complete atrophy of the former, and the ancient Roman depravity of the latter. In the early period of that Greco-Roman civilization, the said maleficent impulses, which have now become being impulses, namely, the passion for inventing fantastic sciences, and the passion for depravity, were inherent in the Greek and Roman beings alone, and later, when, as I've already said, the beings of both these communities chanced to acquire the said strength, and began coming into contact with and influencing the beings of other communities, the beings of many other communities of your unfortunate favorites gradually began to be infected by these peculiar and unnatural being impulses. This took place, on the one hand, as I have already said, owing to the constant influence of both these communities, and on the other hand, owing to that peculiarity of their psyche, common to all the three-brained beings of the planet, and already well fixed in it before this, which is called there imitation. And thus, little by little, these inventions of those two ancient communities have brought it about that already at the present time the psyche of your favorites, shaky enough already before then, has now become so unhinged in all of them without exception that both their world outlook and the whole ordering of their daily existence rest and proceed exclusively on the basis of those two said inventions of the beings of that Greco-Roman civilization, namely, on the basis of fantasizing and of striving for sexual gratification. Here it is very interesting to notice that although, as I've already told you, thanks to the inheritance from the ancient Romans, organic self-shame, proper to three-brained beings, has gradually and entirely disappeared from the presences of your favorites, nevertheless there has arisen in them in its place something rather like it. In the presences of your contemporary favorites there is as much as you like of this pseudo-being impulse, which they also call shame, but the data for engendering it, just as of all others, are quite singular. This being impulse arises in their presences only when they do something which, under their abnormally established conditions of ordinary being existence, is not acceptable to be done before others. But if nobody sees what they do, then nothing they do, even if in their own consciousness and their own feelings it should be undesirable, engenders any such impulse in them. The bliss prepared there by the ancient Romans has in recent times already so penetrated the nature of your favorites breeding on all the continents of that ill-fated planet, that it is even difficult to say which beings of which contemporary communities have inherited most from these obliging Romans. But as regards the inheritance passed down from the ancient Greeks, namely the passion for inventing various fantastic sciences, this has not become inherent to all the three-brained beings of contemporary times equally, but it has passed down only to certain beings arising among the beings of all the contemporary large and small communities breeding on all the terra firma parts of the surface of that peculiar planet. Proportionately, this passion, namely to invent fantastic sciences, has passed down from the ancient Greeks mainly to the beings of the contemporary community existing there under the name of Germany. The beings of that contemporary Germany can be boldly called the direct heirs of the ancient Greek civilization. And they can be so called because, at the present time, it is just they who chiefly bring every kind of new science and invention into contemporary civilization. Unfortunately, my boy, the beings of that contemporary community Germany have in many respects, as it is said, surpassed the beings of ancient Greece. Thanks to the sciences invented by the ancient Greeks, only the being-mentation of other beings was spoiled and still continues to be spoiled. But in addition to this, the contemporary beings of that community Germany have become very skillful also in inventing those sciences, thanks to which the said specific disease there of wiseacring has been very widely spread among other of your favorites. And during the process of this disease in them, many of them semi-consciously or even quite automatically chance to notice some small detail of the common cosmic process which actualizes everything existing. And afterwards, informing others of it, they together use it for some of their, as they are called, new inventions, thereby adding to the number of those new means of which during the last 2 of their centuries so many have accumulated there that their total effect has now already become what is called the resultant decomposing force, in contradistinction to what is called the resultant creative force of nature. And indeed, my boy, owing merely to the sciences invented by the beings of the contemporary Germany, other 3-brained beings of your planet, belonging both to that same community and to other communities, have now acquired the possibility of inventing, and now they almost every day invent here and there some such new invention or new means, and employing them in the process of their existence, have now already brought it about that poor nature there, already enfeebled without this through no fault of her own, is scarcely able to actualize what are called her evolutionary and involutionary processes. For your clear representation and better understanding how these contemporary direct heirs have surpassed their legators, I must now explain to you also about certain widely used means existing there at the present time, which owe their existence exclusively to these nature-helping direct heirs of ancient Greece. I will explain to you certain of these means there, now existing and in use everywhere, which have been invented by the beings of that contemporary community, Germany. I should like first to emphasize, by the way, one very odd phenomenon, namely that these contemporary substitutes for the ancient Greeks give names to their said maleficent inventions, names which for some reason or other all end in INE. As examples of the very many particularly maleficent inventions of those German beings, let us take just those 5 what are called chemical substances, now existing there under the names of satkain, aniline, cocaine, atropine, and alizarin, which chemical substances are used there at the present time by the beings of all the continents and islands, as our dear Mullah Nasruddin says, even without any economizing. The first of the enumerated means specially invented by the German beings, namely satkain, is nothing else but samukuruazar, that is to say, one of those 7 what are called neutralizing gases, which arise and are present in the common presence of each planet, and which take part in the completed crystallization of every definite surplanetary and interplanetary formation, and which, in separate states, are always and everywhere what are called indiscriminate destroyers of the already arisen. About this German invention, I once also learned there, among other things, that when one of the beings of that community, for reasons I recently described, happened to obtain this gas from some surplanetary and interplanetary definite formations, and noticed in the said way its particularity, and told several others about it, then, owing to the fact that there was then proceeding in the presences of the beings of their community, consequently in them themselves, what is called the most intense experiencing of the chief particularity of the psyche of the three-brained beings of your planet, namely, the urgent need to destroy the existence of others like themselves. And indeed, the beings of that community were then fully absorbed in their process of reciprocal destruction with the beings of neighboring communities. These others, thereupon, at once enthusiastically decided to devote themselves entirely to finding means to employ the special property of that gas for the speedy mass destruction of the existence of the beings of other communities. Having begun their practical researches with this aim in view, one of them soon discovered that if this gas is concentrated in a pure state, in such a way that it could be freely liberated in any given space at any given time, it could easily be employed for the mentioned aim. That was sufficient, and from then on this gas, artificially isolated from the general harmony of the actualization of everything existing, began to be liberated, in a certain way, into space, by all the other ordinary beings of that community during the process of reciprocal destruction, just when and just where the greatest number of beings of other, as they are called, hostile communities were grouped. When this isolated, particularly poisonous cosmic substance is intentionally liberated into the atmosphere under the said conditions, and when, striving to reblend with other corresponding cosmic substances, it happens to enter the planetary bodies of three-brained beings nearby, it instantly and completely destroys their existence, or, at best, permanently injures the functioning of one or other part of their common presence. The second of the chemical substances I enumerated, namely aniline, is that chemical coloring substance by means of which most of those surplanetary formations can be dyed, from which the three-brained beings there make all kinds of objects they need in the process of their ordinary being existence. Although, thanks to that invention, your favorites can now dye any object any color, yet what the lastingness of the existence of these objects becomes, just there lies their famous Bismarck's pet cat. Before that maleficent aniline existed, the objects produced by your favorites for their ordinary existence, such, for instance, as what are called carpets, pictures, and various articles of wool, wood, and skin, were dyed with simple vegetable dyes, which they had learned during centuries how to obtain. And these just enumerated objects would formerly last from 5 to 10 or even 15 of their centuries. But now, thanks merely to the aniline, or to dyes of other names into which this same aniline enters as the basis, there remains of the objects dyed with new colors, at most after about 30 years, only perhaps the memory of them. I must also say that the beings of the contemporary community Germany have been the cause not only that, thanks to this maleficent aniline, the productions of all the contemporary beings of this planet are quickly destroyed, but also that productions from ancient times have almost ceased to exist on that ill-fated planet. This latter occurred because, for various Hasnamussian purposes, and for their famous, as they call them, scientific aims, they collected the surviving ancient productions from all countries, and Not knowing how to preserve ancient objects, they only hastened their speedy destruction. But they used and still use those antiques they collected as models for cheap goods, which are everywhere known on that ill-fated planet by the name of ersatz. As for the third of the enumerated chemical substances they invented, namely cocaine, that chemical substance is not only also of great assistance to nature in more rapidly decomposing the planetary formations, in this instance their own planetary bodies, but this chemical means has an effect on the psyche of the contemporary beings of the planet Earth surprisingly similar to that which the famous organ Kundabuffer had on the psyche of their ancestors. When their ancestors had that invention in themselves of the great angel Luisos, then, thanks to this organ, they were always exactly in the same state as the contemporary beings are when they introduce into themselves this German invention called cocaine. I must warn you, my boy, that even if the action of that German invention is similar to the action of the famous organ Kundabuffer, it happened without any conscious intention on the part of the contemporary beings of the community Germany. They became colleagues of the great angel Luisos only by chance. At the present time, almost all the beings who become genuine representatives of contemporary civilization very meticulously, and with the greatest delight and tenderness, introduce into themselves this blessing of contemporary civilization, of course always to the glory, as our dear Mullah Nasruddin says, of the cloven-hoofed. The fourth of the enumerated chemical substances, namely atropine, is also everywhere there in great demand at the present time for a great variety of purposes, but its most common use is for a certain exceedingly strange purpose. It seems that, thanks to the same abnormally established conditions there of ordinary being existence, their organ of sight has acquired the property of regarding the faces of others as good and pleasing only when they have dark eyes. And when this chemical substance called atropine is in a certain way introduced into the eye of beings, the pupils become dilated and darker. And because of this, most of them introduce this atropine into their eyes, in order that their faces may appear good and pleasing to others. And truly, my dear boy, those terrestrial beings who introduce this German blessing into their eyes do have very dark eyes until they are 45. I said until 45 because so far there has never been a case there when a being using this means could see and still continue its use after the age of 45. Alizarin, the fifth and last of the enumerated inventions, is also widespread everywhere, and that blessing of contemporary civilization is used there chiefly by what are called confectioners and other specialists who prepare for the other beings of that planet more tasty articles for their first food. These confectioners and other professionals there who prepare the said tasty articles for the first food of the rest of your favorites use this same German surefire composition, alizarin, of course unconsciously, for that purpose which has there already finally become the ideal for the whole of the contemporary civilization, which purpose is expressed in the language of our honored Mullah Nasruddin in the following words: "As long as everything looks fine and dandy to me, what does it matter if the grass doesn't grow?" Anyhow, my boy, those contemporary substitutes for the beings of ancient Greece are already now a great help to poor nature, though only in the process of decomposition,
with all their practical attainments based on the sciences they have themselves invented. It is not for nothing that our dear Mullah Nasr ad-Din has the following wise expression: "Better pull 10 hairs a day out of your mother's head than not help nature." Strictly speaking, the capacity to cook up fantastic sciences and to devise new methods for ordinary being existence there did not pass from the ancient Greeks to the beings of that contemporary Germany alone. The same capacity was perhaps no less also inherited by the beings of another contemporary community, also an independent one, and also in her turn enjoying dominion. That other contemporary community of your favorites is called England. There has even passed from ancient Greece to the beings of that second contemporary community, England, and directly to them alone, one of their most maleficent inventions, which the beings of that contemporary community have most thoroughly adopted and now actualize in practice. This particularly maleficent invention of theirs the ancient Greeks called diaphoron, and the contemporary beings call sport. About this contemporary sport there, I shall explain to you in as much detail as possible at the end of my tale. But you must meanwhile know that though the beings of that community, England, also now invent large quantities of the various new objects required by your favorites in the process of their ordinary being existence, nevertheless they do not invent chemical substances like the beings of the contemporary community Germany. No. They invent chiefly what are called metal wares. Especially in recent times, they have become expert in inventing and in distributing to the beings existing over the whole of the surface of your planet vast quantities of every kind of metal wares, called their locks, razors, mousetraps, revolvers, scythes, machine guns, saucepans, hinges, guns, penknives, cartridges, pens, mines, needles, and many other things of the same kind. And ever since the beings of this contemporary community started inventing these practical objects, the ordinary existence of the three-brained beings of your planet has been, just as our dear Mullah Nasr ad-Din says, not life, but free jam. The beings of that contemporary community have been the benefactors of the other contemporary beings of your planet, offering them, as they say there, philanthropic aid, especially as regards their first being duty, namely, the duty of carrying out from time to time the process of reciprocal destruction. Thanks to them, the discharge of that being duty of theirs has gradually become, for your contemporary favorites, the merest trifle. In the absence of those inventions, it used to be exceedingly arduous for these poor favorites of yours to fulfill that being duty, because they were formerly forced to spend a good deal of sweat for it. But thanks to the adaptations of every kind invented by those contemporary beings, it is now, as again our esteemed Mullah Nasr ad-Din says, just roses, roses. The contemporary beings now scarcely need to make any effort whatsoever in order to destroy completely the existence of beings like themselves. Sometimes, sitting quietly in what they call their smoking rooms, they can destroy, just as a pastime, as it were, tens and sometimes even hundreds of others like themselves. I might as well now, I think, tell you a little also about the still existing direct descendants of the beings of the mentioned Greek-Roman civilization. The descendants of the beings of the once great and powerful community Greece there still continue to exist, and also to have their own independent community, But for the other independent communities there, they have at the present time scarcely any significance whatever. They already no longer do as their ancestors did there, who were supreme specialists in cooking up all kinds of fantastic sciences. For if a contemporary Greek cooked up a new science, the beings of the other communities of the present time would not pay it the smallest attention. And they would pay no attention to it chiefly because that community has not at the present time enough of what are called guns and ships to be for the other contemporary beings there what is called an authority. But though the descendants of the former great Greeks, namely the Greeks of the present time, have lost the trick of being what is called an imagined authority for other three-brained beings there, they have now perfectly adapted themselves there on almost all the continents and islands to keeping what are called shops, where without any haste, slowly and gently, they trade in what are called sponges, halva, rahat lokum, Turkish delight, etc., and sometimes Persian dried fruit, never forgetting the dried fish called kefal. And as for the descendants of the famous Romans, although they too continue to arise and exist, they no longer even bear the name of their ancestors, though they still call the chief place of their community by the name Rome. The contemporary beings of the community formed by the descendants of those former shepherds, afterwards the great Romans, are called by the other beings there Italians. Except for that specific being impulse, which the ancient Roman beings were the first on that planet to crystallize in their presences, and which subsequently spread gradually to all the other three-brained beings of that planet, scarcely anything else had passed by inheritance from their ancestors to these beings called Italians. The beings of that contemporary community, Italy, exists at the present time very quietly and peacefully, doing nothing more than unostentatiously inventing ever new forms of their harmless and very innocent what is called macaroni. Nevertheless, there had passed to certain beings of that contemporary Italy by heredity from their ancestors one special and very peculiar property called giving pleasure to others. Only they manifest this inherited need, that is to say, this giving pleasure, not towards beings there like themselves, but to beings of other forms. It must in fairness be stated that the said special property passed to beings of various parts of contemporary Italy, not from the great Romans alone. This inherited property became more naturalized by their ancestors of considerably later epochs, namely at the time when they began spreading,
among other beings,
both of their own community and of neighboring weaker communities, the doctrines already changed for their egoistic purposes of a certain genuine sacred messenger from above. At the present time, the beings of various parts of contemporary Italy actualize this property of giving pleasure to others in the following way. The existence of the quadruped being called sheep and goats, whose planetary bodies they also use for their first food, they do not destroy all at once, but in order to give this pleasure, they do it slowly and gently over a period of many days. That is to say, one day they take off one leg, then a few days later a second leg, and so on, for as long as the sheep or goat still breathes. And the sheep and goats can breathe without the said parts of their common presence for a very long time, because in the main functions of the taking in of cosmic substances for the possibility of existing, these parts do not participate, though they do participate in the functions which actualize those impulses giving self-sensations. After what I have already said, there seems no need to say any more about the descendants of those Romans who were once so menacing and so great for the other communities there. Now, let us talk about the particularly maleficent invention of the ancient Greeks, which is being actualized in practice at the present time by the beings of the contemporary community there called England, and which invention they call sport. Not only have the beings of the contemporary community England, namely those beings who chiefly actualize during the process of their ordinary existence this particularly maleficent invention of the ancient Greeks, added, thanks to its maleficent consequences, one more surefire factor for shortening the duration of their existence, already trifling enough without that, but also experiencing in their turn, at the present time, the greatness of their community. They are in consequence authorities for the other three-brained beings there, and furthermore, because they have made the actualizing of the invention in practice their ideal, and its spreading their aim, they at the present time by every possible means strongly infect the beings of all other large and small communities of that ill-fated planet with that invention of theirs. The basis for that very serious misconception there was the disappearance from the common presence of those favorites of yours of the possibility of the crystallization in them of those factors which actualize logical mentation in three-brained beings. And in consequence of the absence in them of this logical mentation, all of them, almost without exception,
merely because certain candidates for Hasnamus there have asserted that they could obtain something good for themselves by means of this sport, an assertion they believe with all their presence, have now, in the hope of attaining this same something, given themselves up entirely to that sport. None of these unfortunates know, and probably never will reflect, that not only is nothing good obtained by them from this maleficent sport of theirs, but they, as I've already told you, solely owing to this sport alone, still further shorten the duration of their existence, which is already sufficiently trifling without this, so that you may better represent to yourself and understand why the duration of their existence is being still further diminished on account of this sport. It is now opportune to explain to you a little more in detail about what I've already promised you to explain, namely, the difference between the duration of being existence according to the Fulasnatamnian principle and according to the Itoklanos principle. You remember that when I explained to you how these favorites of yours define the flow of time, I said that when the organ Kundabuffer with all its properties was removed from their presences, and they began to have the same duration of existence as all normal three-brained beings arising everywhere in our universe, that is, according to what is called the Fulasnatamnian principle, they also should then have existed without fail until their second being body Kesdjan had been completely coated in them, and finally perfected by reason up to the sacred Ishmesh. But later, when they began existing in a manner more and more unbecoming for three-brained beings, and entirely ceased actualizing in their presences their being particadol duty, foreseen by great nature, by means of which alone it is possible for three-brained beings to acquire in their presences the data for coding their said higher parts. And when, in consequence of all this, the quality of their radiation failed to respond to the demands of the most great common cosmic trogo-auto-egocratic process. Then great nature was compelled, for the purpose of equalizing vibrations, gradually to actualize the duration of their existence according to the principle called itoklanos, that is, the principle upon which in general is actualized the duration of existence of one-brained and two-brained beings, who have not the same possibilities as the three-brained beings, and who are therefore unable to actualize in their presences the said, foreseen by nature, partkdog duty. According to this principle, the duration of being existence, and also the whole of the contents of their common presences, are in general acquired from the results arising from the following 7 actualizations surrounding them, namely from 1. Heredity in general, 2. Conditions and environment at the moment of conception, 3. The combination of radiations of all the planets of their solar system during their formation in the womb of their productress. 4. The degree of being manifestation of their producers during the period they are attaining the age of responsible being. 5. The quality of being existence, similar to themselves, around them. 6. The quality of what are called the teleokrimalnichnian thought waves, formed in the atmosphere surrounding them, also during their period of attaining the age of majority, that is, the sincerely manifested good wishes and actions on the part of what are called the beings of the same blood. And finally, 7. The quality of what are called the being egoplasticuri of the given being himself, that is, his being efforts for the transubstantiation in himself of all the data for obtaining objective reason. The chief particularity of existence, according to this principle itoklanos, is that in the presences of beings existing according to it, dependent upon the enumerated 7 exterior actualizations, there are crystallized in their being localizations, which represent in beings the central places of the sources of actualization of all the separate independent parts of their common presence, or, as your favorites say, in their brains, what are called bobbin candlenosts, that is to say, something that gives in the given localizations or brains a definite quantity of possible associations or experiencings. And so, my boy, because these contemporary favorites of yours, these three-brained beings of the planet Earth, already arise only according to the principle itoklanos, therefore, from the moment of conception up to the age of responsible being, there are crystallized in their brains these bobbin candlenosts, with very definite possibilities of actualizing the process of association. For the greater elucidation of this question, and for your better understanding, and also not to waste time on explanations concerning the essence itself, and also the forms of functioning of such definite cosmic realizations as these just mentioned bobbin candlenosts, which are lawfully crystallized in the localizations or brains of those beings who exist only on the basis of itoklanos, I intend to take as an elucidating example just those jamtesternochi, such as your favorites also have, and which they call mechanical watches. As you already well know, although such jamtesternochi, or mechanical watches, are of different what are called systems, yet they are all constructed on the same principle of tension or pressure of the unwinding spring. One system of jam tester nochi, or mechanical watch, contains a spring exactly calculated and arranged so that the length of the duration of its tension from unwinding may be sufficient for 24 hours. Another system has a spring for a week, a third for a month, and so on. The bobbin candlenost in the brains of beings existing only according to the principle itoklanos corresponds to the spring in mechanical watches of various systems. Just as the duration of the movement of mechanical watches depends upon the spring they contain, so the duration of the existence of beings depends exclusively on the bobbin candlenost formed in their brains during their arising and during the process of their further formation. Just as the spring of a watch has a winding of a definite duration, so these beings also can associate and experience only as much as the possibilities for experiencing put into them by nature during the crystallization of those same bobbin candlenosts in their brains. They can associate and consequently exist just so much, and not a whit more nor less. As mechanical watches can act as long as the spring has what is called the tension of winding, so the beings in whose brains the said bobbin candlenosts are crystallized can experience and consequently exist until these bobbin candlenosts formed in their brains, owing to the mentioned 7 external conditions, are used up. And so, my boy, as the results of particadog duty were no longer thereafter obtained in the presences of your favorites, and the duration of their existence began to depend exclusively on the results of the 7 accidentally arranged external conditions I have just enumerated, then, thanks to all this, the length of their existence, especially among the contemporary beings, has become very varied. At the present time, the duration of their existence may be from one of their minutes up to 70 or 90 of their years. And so, owing to all I've just said, however your favorites may exist, whatever measures they may adopt, or even if, as they say, they should put themselves in a glass case, as soon as the contents of the bobbin candlenosts crystallized in their brains are used up, one or another of their brains immediately ceases to function. The difference between mechanical watches and your contemporary favorites is only that in mechanical watches there is one spring, while your favorites have 3 of these independent bobbin candlenosts. And these independent bobbin candlenosts in all the 3 independent localizations in 3-brained beings have the following names. The first, the bobbin candlenost of the thinking center. The second, the bobbin candlenost of the feeling center. The third, the bobbin candlenost of the moving center. Even that fact, which I have recently often repeated, namely that the process of the sacred ras kuarno is actualized for these favorites of yours in thirds, or, as they themselves would say, they begin to die in parts, proceeds also from the fact that, arising and being formed only according to the principle itoklanos, and existing non-harmoniously, they disproportionately use up the contents, namely their bobbin candlenosts of these 3 separate independent brains, and hence it is that such a horrible dying as is not proper to 3-brained beings frequently occurs to them. During my stay here among them, I personally very often constated their dying by thirds. This was possible because, although in the presences of your favorites, especially the contemporary ones, the bobbin candlenost of one of their brains may be entirely used up,
Nevertheless, the beings themselves would sometimes continue to exist for quite a long time. For instance, it often happens there that owing to their specifically abnormal existence, the contents of one of the bobbin candlenostes may be used up in one of them, and if it is of the moving center, or as they themselves call it, the spinal brain, then although such a contemporary three-brained being there continues to think and to feel, yet he has already lost the possibility of intentionally directing the parts of his planetary body. Here it is interesting to notice that when one of your contemporary favorites already partially dies for good in this way,
then their contemporary Zerlichners,
or as they are called, physicians, look upon such a death as most certainly a disease, and with every kind of wiseacring that has become proper to them, start treating it. And they give these supposed diseases every sort of name consonant with an ancient language utterly unknown to them called Latin. The very widely spread diseases there with such names as the following: hemiplegia, paraplegia, paralysis progressiva, essentialis, tabes dorsalis, paralysis agitanus, sclerosis disseminata, and so on and so forth. Such deaths by thirds there on the planet Earth, which has taken your fancy, have occurred particularly frequently during the last 2 centuries. And they occur to those of your favorites who, thanks either to their profession or to one of their what are called passions, arising and acquired by the beings belonging to all large and small communities there, on account of the same abnormally arranged conditions of their ordinary being existence, have during their long existence lived through, in a greater or smaller degree, the contents of the bobbin candlenost of one or another of their being brains. For instance, a 1/3 death, on account of the bobbin candlenost of the moving center or spinal brain, often occurs there among those terrestrial beings who give themselves up to that occupation which the beings belonging to the contemporary community England now practice, thanks to the maleficent invention of the ancient Greeks, and which maleficent occupation they now call sport. The character of the pernicious consequences of that maleficent occupation there
you will well understand when I tell you
that during my stay among those favorites of yours, I once prepared a special section of my statistics for elucidating to myself how long these three-brained beings there can exist, who become what are called wrestlers by profession. And never once in those statistics of mine did I notice that any of them had existed longer than 49 of their years. And a 1/3 death through the premature using up of the bobbin candlenost of the feeling center occurs for the most part among those terrestrial beings who become by profession what are called representatives of art. Most of these terrestrial professionals, especially the contemporary ones, first fall ill with one or another form of what is called psychopathy, and thanks to this, they later in their psychopathy intentionally learn, as they say, to feel, and thereafter repeatedly feeling these abnormal being impulses, they gradually use up the contents of the bobbin candlenost of their feeling center, and thus disharmonizing the tempo of their own common presences, bring themselves to that peculiar end which is not often met with, even among them there. Here, by the way, it is very interesting also to notice that the 1/3 death through the feeling center occurs among your favorites also thanks to one very peculiar form of psychopathy called their altruism. And concerning premature partial death through the bobbin candlenost of the thinking center, the deaths of this kind among your favorites occur in recent times more and more frequently. This kind of death,
through the thinking center occurs there chiefly among those favorites of yours who try to become, or have already become, scientists of new formation, and also among those who, during the period of their existence, fall ill with the craze for reading what are called books and newspapers. The result, among those three-brained beings there, of reading superfluously and associating only by thoughts, is that the contents of the bobbin candlenost of their thinking center are exhausted before the contents of the bobbin candlenos of their other being centers. And so, my boy, all these misfortunes, namely the shortening of the duration of their existence, and also many other consequences, maleficent for them themselves, occur to your favorites exclusively only because they have even until now not yet learned of the existence of the cosmic law called equalization of many-sourced vibrations. If only such an idea occurred to them, and they were merely to perform their usual wiseacrings with it, perhaps then they would get to understand one very simple, as they call it, secret. I admit that somebody would be certain to understand this secret because, in the first place, it is simple and obvious, and secondly, because they discovered it long ago, and they even often employed it in what they call practical use. They even use this simple secret to which I referred for those mechanical watches which we took for comparison as an elucidating example concerning the duration of their existence. In all the mechanical watches of various systems, they use this said simple secret for regulating what is called the tension of the said spring, or the corresponding part of the general mechanism of the watch, and it is called, it seems, the regulator. By means of this regulator, it is possible to make the mechanism of a watch, wound for instance for 24 hours, go a whole month. And on the contrary, thanks to this regulator, it is possible to make the same winding for 24 hours finish in 5 minutes. In the common presence of every being existing merely on the basis of itoklanos, something similar to the regulator in a mechanical watch is present and is called transamkeep. This something means not to give oneself up to those of one's associations resulting from the functioning of only one or another of one's brains. But even if they should understand such a simple secret, it will be all just the same. They still would not make the necessary being effort, quite accessible even to the contemporary beings, and thanks to which, by the foresight of nature, beings in general acquire the possibility of what is called harmonious association, by virtue of which alone energy is created for active being existence in the presence of every three-brained being, and consequently in them themselves. But at the present time, this energy can be elaborated in the presences of your favorites only during their quite unconscious state, that is to say, during what they call sleep. But in your favorites, especially in your contemporary favorites who exist constantly passively under the direction of only one of the separate spiritualized parts of their common presence, and thereby constantly manifest themselves entirely by their factors for negative properties also lawfully arisen in them, and hence by negative manifestations there proceeds in them that same disproportionate expenditure of the contents of their various bobbin candlenosts, that is to say, the possibilities placed in them by nature according to law, of action by only one or only two of their brains,
are always experienced, in consequence of which the contents of one or two of their bobbin candlenosts are prematurely exhausted. Whereupon, just like those mechanical watches in which the winding is run down, or the force of their regulators is weakened, they cease to act. Some time later, I shall explain to you in detail not only why, when beings existing only according to the principle itoklanos exist by the direction of only one or two of their spiritualized sources, and not harmoniously, that is to say, with all three combined, and in agreement, that particular brain of theirs in which there were superfluous associations is prematurely used up in them, and consequently dies during the period of its existence. But also why, owing to this, the other bobbin candlenosts also are used up, even without their own action. But here you must also know that even on your planet, one still occasionally finds one of your favorites whose duration of planetary existence extends to 5 of their centuries. You will then understand very well that in the case of certain of your favorites, even of recent times, who by some means or other find out and correctly transubstantiate in their reason concerning certain details of the law of association proceeding in the separate brains of beings, and also concerning the reciprocal action of these independent associations, and who exist more or less according to what I have said, the bobbin candlenosts formed in their separate being brains are not used up, as they are among the other beings there, but their common presence acquires the possibility of existing much longer than the other three-brained beings there. During my stay there for the last time, I myself personally met several of these terrestrial contemporary three-brained beings who were already 2, 3, and even about 4 of their centuries old. I met them mostly among a small brotherhood of the three-brained beings there, composed of beings from almost all of their what are called religions, and whose permanent place of existence was in the middle of the continent Asia. The beings of that brotherhood, it seems, partly elucidated for themselves the mentioned laws of association in being brains, and in part such information reached them from ancient times through genuine initiates there. As for that same contemporary community whose beings have become the chief victims of that particularly maleficent invention of the beings of the said ancient civilization, they not only now use it in the process of their own existence, but they try to infect strongly the beings of all the other communities with the same evil. Moreover, owing to that maleficent sport of theirs, these unfortunates not only still further diminish the duration of their own existence, already trifling without this, but, thanks to that action of theirs, they will, in my opinion, eventually entail for their community what quite recently occurred to a large community there named Russia. I thought about it during my stay there before my final departure from that planet. And I first began thinking about it when I learned that the power-possessing beings, also of that no less great contemporary community, were already utilizing that maleficent means of theirs, sport, for their own Hasnamussian aims, exactly as the power-possessing beings of the community Russia had, for their similar aims, utilized what is called the question of Russian vodka. Just as the power-possessing beings of the community Russia then tried by every kind of artifice to instill into the weak wills of the ordinary beings the necessity of the intensive use of the said Russian vodka, so also the power-possessing beings of that community, England, are now already also maneuvering to intrigue the ordinary beings of their community with this same sport, and to urge them to it by every means. The apprehensions which then arose in me are already, it seems, being justified. And I conclude this from the etherogram I recently received from the planet Mars, in which, among other things, it was said that though there are more than 2.5 million of what are called unemployed beings in that community, England, yet the power-possessing beings there take no measures concerning this, but endeavor to spread still more widely among them that same famous sport of theirs. Just as in the large community Russia, the contents of all what are called newspapers and magazines used to be always devoted to the question of Russian vodka, so now in that community England, more than half of the text of all their evil sowers is devoted to that famous sport.